Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I have been doing some good reading in the month of June, which, as it turns out, is also Pride Month. I started off my reading this month just by picking some books that I had wanted to read anyway, and then realised that I could very easily make it my intention to read primarily queer LGBTQ+ books for this month. And then as I did my reading, I realised that I could actually fill out a significant portion of the acronym. And so by the end of this month, I managed to read a book for every single letter of LGBTQIA. Isn't that cool? So I thought I would just make a video talking about these queer books that I have read, because some of them were excellent, others were a bit of a miss, but I have a lot of thoughts, so I will just get started. The first book that I read this month was Wonderland by Juno Dawson. This is one that you will remember if you watched my recent book haul video. I talked very briefly about it because I wasn't entirely sure what it was about, but now I have read it and so I can tell you in a lot more detail. This is a modern reworking of Alice in Wonderland. It follows Alice Dodgson, who is a trans girl going to a very strict Catholic boarding school, who has just had a one-night stand with one of the most popular girls in her year, Bunny Liddell. However, during the time that they were together before they slept together, Bunny seemed very worried about something. She is a bit of a mysterious character, certainly for a popular person, and she very frequently goes missing. However, because she's rich, she normally just turns up somewhere in Europe and no one is worried, but Alice is worried because Bunny sounds like she thinks someone is out to get her. And so when Bunny does indeed go missing the next day, Alice takes it upon herself to try and work out what has happened to Bunny. So looking in her pigeonhole for where letters to Bunny will be sent, she finds an invitation to an extremely elite party called Wonderland. And using the details given on the invite, Alice decides to go to Wonderland, the party, to see if she can work out where Bunny has gone. So she ends up going to this enormous, hedonous, bacchanal-like party where she does a really ridiculous amount of drugs, drinks a lot, sleeps around, meets some really, really weird people, and uncovers a lot of weird stuff. When I said I thought this was going to be a retelling of Alice in Wonderland, I thought it was going to be like a modern version of the events, that it was going to be quite fantasy-based or magical realism-based in its setting and genre. However, this was much more of a contemporary thriller-style book. For all the weirdness at the party, it can all easily be explained in real-world terms. Alice hallucinates a lot while she's at the party, especially hallucinating her father who left her when she was very young, but this is explained both by her doing a lot of drugs and also because she is on antipsychotics because she had a breakdown the year before, but she doesn't take them with her when she goes to this multi-day long party and so ends up slipping into her old state of mind. I thought this book was just awesome. From the get-go, I was really, really invested in Alice as a character. She is snarky, she's not afraid to break the rules, but she generally has quite a strict moral code and knows what she thinks is right and wrong. And that was really fascinating just to see in the opening scenes where she's at school, then compared to her getting into all the different messes that she ends up in once she's at Wonderland. Because she is trans, she has a huge amount of insight into womanhood and femininity and what it means to be a woman, and that is explored really, really interestingly through her inner narrative voice that you hear throughout the story. And there are some excellent one-liners about performative femininity. It was fascinating. It was also a really interesting exploration of upper-class society. Wonderland is an elitist party. Bunny only gets in because her family is incredibly wealthy, and Alice only gets in because she stole Bunny's invitation. Once Alice is there, she meets some really, really wealthy people, and she gets to see just how messed up their wealth and power has made them. She meets the son of a huge tech billionaire who is the caterpillar. She also meets Paisley Hart, the Queen of Hearts, who it turns out has some really, really messed up stuff going on. I will not say what, however I will say please, please, please check the trigger warnings for this book because, oh my god, there are so many different things. You know, I knew this was going to be quite heavy, I knew it was going to be dark in places because it talks about so much stuff to do with gender and mental illness and partying and drugs. However, oh my god, there is some weird stuff that goes on. But yes, Paisley Heart in particular, terrifying but fascinating, especially Alice's reactions at the very end of the book, once Wonderland is over and she is actually back at school after the events. It was excellent. It was one of those books that I thought might weird me out too much for me to enjoy it, but as it was, I was weirded out just the right amount and I thought it was phenomenal. Can't recommend this enough for really, really interesting explorations of societal pressures, of gender, of all the rest. However, please check the trigger warnings. It was a lot, and although I could handle it quite comfortably, there were moments where I was severely grossed out and weirded out, and for people who have specific triggers to do with some of the topics explored in this story, it could well be too much. So yes, please check that, but don't let it stop you from reading it if this is something you're interested in, because oh my god, it was awesome. Oh wait, nearly forgot to say. So, in terms of the representation in this book, Alice is a trans woman, so we get our T. She is also bisexual or pansexual or generally queer. She expresses interest in both men and women in this book and seems to be completely unfussed by gender as a whole. So she can also count for the Q for queer or for the B for bisexual or any other of the sexualities that encompass interest in multiple genders. Okay, next we come to another of the books that I mentioned in my haul video, The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue. This was underwhelming for me, I have to say. I was really disappointed that I didn't like it more, but I think I could work out why that was, and so I can give some fairly good answers for it. Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue, if you don't know, is about Henry Montague, also known as Monty, who is the son of a lord in England in the 1700s, I believe, and he is off on his tour of Europe before he takes over the family estate. He is going with his younger sister Felicity and with his longtime crush and best friend Percy, just to see the sights of Europe, to get a bit of an education before he is stuck at home for the rest of his life. However, he ends up making some severe faux pas in a variety of social situations, ends up stealing a very, very important item, which leads to him, Percy and Felicity being chased around Europe with the people he stole from trying to get this item back. I wasn't expecting this to be the main plotline of the story. When I had heard people talking about this book, they mostly talked about it as the love story between Monty and Percy, with that being the main focus of the plot. However, this is side plot at best, I have to be said, and I wasn't a big fan of the main adventure plot. It was a really, really weird tonal shift, especially because the book does start out like it's going to be a romance, mostly a fairly steamy romance about Monty and Percy, realising they both have feelings for each other and getting together. But it jars very, very quickly from that to, oh god, we're being pursued around the continent and we need to work out what to do with this thing that Monty took. And I was completely taken aback by it. It was really, really odd. I also saw in the front a reviewer described it as anachronistic, which I think is a very generous term for it tries to throw in as much historical fact as possible, but is completely unconcerned with modern day slang, modern day phrasing and behaviours that just don't get explained and are just thrown in there alongside the historical stuff. It didn't really make a huge amount of sense, to be honest, and it made it quite jarring for me to read personally, as someone who likes historical fiction a lot and particularly likes accurate historical fiction. I would love to be able to learn about the time period I'm reading about by reading a fiction story, and this definitely did not do that. My other main technical quibble before I get into sort of the plot-based quibbles, this is a long-ass book. This is just over 500 pages long, and yet I have no idea why it's so long. The writing is very, very sparse. There is very little depth, there is very little description. It is just a lot of cobbled together plot with a couple of very, very minor inner monologues. And yet I don't know how it's 500 pages. It really doesn't feel like there's enough plot or anything else to create a story of that length, so I am just baffled as to how it ended up being so long, and really why it wasn't cut down for convenience of reading, especially because the pacing in this is bizarre. I think this is my biggest complaint, both with The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue and The Lady's Guide to Petticoats and Piracy, which I'll be talking about in a minute. The pacing is so weird. There will be huge stretches of time where we are given descriptions of how boring and long it is for Monty, Percy and Felicity to be travelling around, about how hard it is, talking about the difficulties of getting from one place to the next, and then there will be a random time skip. So the book opens with Monty being told it's time to leave and he gets on the carriage, and then suddenly it's 2 months later and they're in France and he's complaining about all the stuff that we didn't actually read about, which made absolutely no sense. It also means that there are very, very convenient time skips plot-wise, where you're just there going, how are they going to get out of this one? You know, how are they going to get from A to B in order to continue this journey? And they just do it behind the scenes. There is no explanation, they are just suddenly where they need to be. With regards to the time skips as well, it makes it very, very difficult to actually establish any interest in Monty and Percy's relationship. We're told they're best friends, we're told that Monty absolutely adores Percy beyond words, but we don't actually see a huge amount of their relationship. I find it really, really hard to care about fictional couples unless I can actually see why I should be wanting them to be together. I want to see that banter between them, that camaraderie, that long-standing friendship that is the reason why Monty has fallen for Percy. And yet because there's such huge time skips in the beginning, we suddenly just get to really weird, awkward, almost kiss scenes, and I'm there going, why do I care about this? Why do I want this romance to happen? I then just want to talk about Monty as a character. I did not like him. He is arrogant, he is overly confident to the point of being annoying, and he has no nuance. This book tries to cover some very difficult topics to talk about, especially in the context of historical context. Percy, his love interest and best friend, is black, mixed race, I believe, and it talks at various points about the impact of him being black in a largely white aristocratic world. There is also discussions of Felicity, who is a young unchaperoned woman going around with her brother and brother's best friend. And there is a heavy amount of discussion about Percy being ill. I won't go into too many details because this is a plot point, but Percy explains that he doesn't want to be cured, and yet Monty, with this stolen item that he has, feels he has the ability to cure Percy, and that as the nominal, I can't even call him a straight white male, as the incredibly arrogant, overly confident and wealthy white man of the group, it is up to him to save Percy and to take care of Felicity, and I really did not like it. He is so selfish and overly concerned with his own interests, and this is pointed out to him at various points by both Percy and Felicity, and it is only when it actually starts to threaten his own personal gain that he starts to take it seriously, and yeah, it bothered me. I couldn't bring myself to care a huge amount about Monty, and therefore I couldn't care about him and Percy being together, and I just kept rolling my eyes at him being insensitive as a plot device, as a vehicle, being unable to explore these topics about race and gender and class with any level of sensitivity because his character is so insensitive and arrogant. Equally, I have to give a little bit of praise for one thing that it explored. Monty talks about being abused by his father for being into boys. I haven't said this yet, but Monty, the main character, is a bisexual man in the 1700s, which definitely wasn't unheard of. Oscar Wilde was obviously later on, but we all know about Oscar Wilde. And he gets kicked out of boarding school for being involved with another boy, and his father abuses him as a result of it. This isn't explored a huge amount early on, but as it goes on, there are numerous situations where Monty is having punches thrown at him or being otherwise physically hurt, and he has flashbacks and he breaks down crying and he doesn't understand why he can't function as he usually does. And it talks a lot about what it means to be a man who has been abused and what it means to be a child abused by a parent, and I thought it handled that with genuine sensitivity. It was one of the only moments in which I actually really cared about Monty. On balance though, I just wasn't a fan of it. It wasn't my thing, it wasn't what I was expecting it to be, and it didn't achieve what I had hoped it could achieve. Bit disappointing. However, in general, glad that I've read it, because I know it's a very, very big book in terms of a lot of people have read it, and it's always good to check these things out. So yeah, in terms of our representation, as I said, Monty is bisexual, Percy is, well, it doesn't say what Percy's sexuality is, but he is clearly into Monty, and so we can therefore assume he is either gay or otherwise into men in some capacity. And Felicity in this book, even very early on, she gives off very strong aromantic and asexual vibes. And so now we are going to talk about The Lady's Guide to Petticoats and Piracy, which is the sequel to the aforementioned book. This story focuses instead on Felicity, who has aged about a year since the previous book and has been living up in Scotland as the helper to a baker who has just proposed marriage to her. Felicity does not want to get married. She wants to be a doctor, but she knows that she can't be because she is a woman in the 1700s. She hears along the grapevine that an old childhood friend is going to be getting married to the very doctor that she is interested in studying under. And so with her in of having known the potential wife of this doctor in childhood, she decides to go and try to work for him. However, in a very Monty and Percy-like way, things do not go as planned, and she ends up on the run with Joanna, her childhood friend, and a black woman named Sim, who is a sailor, and they end up trying to find the research that Joanna's mother did before she died, which Sim also has some investment in. I thought this book was so much better than The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue. This had so much more going for it. Personally, Felicity is just so much more of an interesting character. I liked her even in the first book, and in this book you get to know her a huge amount better. You especially get to see a lot more of her internal monologue about being a woman in the 1700s, especially as a woman who is not interested in getting married. That is the only thing that women could really do. You had nothing unless it was your husband's. The struggle that Felicity feels between knowing that she could have a comfortable marriage to a baker in Scotland but continue to be unfulfilled, or that she can keep striving towards her difficult dreams but undoubtedly fail at them, was really relatable and especially interesting in those contexts of being someone who is completely uninterested in relationships. I thought they were really, really relatable discussions of female autonomy, about women's roles in society, the role of marriage, and especially from the perspective of an aromantic asexual. She reflects a huge amount on what it might be like if she was interested in those things, and especially in the contexts of Joanna, because when they were children they were very much kindred spirits, and so Felicity feels somewhat betrayed by Joanna now going the traditional route of getting a husband. The relationship that I was most interested in the exploration of was between Felicity and Joanna, childhood friends who drifted apart because Felicity was incredibly cruel to Joanna after Joanna expressed an interest in going the traditional route, whereas Felicity couldn't see herself doing it. I thought it was fantastic. There were some really relatable moments in which Felicity was aching inside because she felt that she knew Joanna so well, even though it had been years since they last spoke. Stories that explore these dynamics between friends, especially between two female friends, mean a lot to me, and I thought this one was done with a huge amount of nuance and depth. I was also really interested in the hot takes on colonialism that went down in this story. Where The Gentleman's Guide failed to have any level of nuance or sensitivity when exploring things like race and class from Monty's perspective, this really went all in. We have Felicity, who is an upper class woman but one who has kind of been shunned by her family. Then we have Joanna, who has a very, very similar situation but who has stake in her mother's research. And then there is also Sim, who is a black, implied to be Muslim, I believe, woman, who is a sailor, who is a pirate, and who has a huge community that relies on natural resources that Joanna's mum's research could take away from them. There was a huge amount of discussion about, preserving what belongs to a people versus scientific progress, and what it means to both, and ultimately coming to the conclusion that preserving something that means more to a group of people is far more important than Western scientific ideals, which I cannot fault. I thought it was done pretty well. I also really appreciated towards the end, as this whole discussion is going on between Felicity, Joanna and Sim as to what to do with this discovery they have made through Joanna's mother's research, they opt for the route of, if you can't beat the rules, change the game, which I thought was excellent. An excellent message in terms of inclusion, but also in terms of all levels of oppression within society. Felicity tries so hard to get into medicine the right way, to go in via universities, to study under an established doctor until she is able to take up her own practice, but she just can't do it. They manage to find a middle ground where they can do their scientific research under their own rules and still be able to have some impact on the world. I thought that was great. One big thing that I disagreed with though. So I've said before, Felicity is aromantic and asexual. Sim is implied to be interested in women from very early on, and then at the midpoint of the book, roughly, spoiler alert, she decides to kiss Felicity just to test whether or not Felicity genuinely isn't interested in people. With no consent, Felicity does not say that she's happy with it, Sim just leans in and kisses her, and this is treated like no big thing. It is not addressed at all, and I think this is a huge detriment to both asexual and aromantic people in this story, and also to communities of women interested in other women. Why are we putting a predatory lesbian in a story about aromanticism and asexuality? This helps neither side. I also really dislike the way it plays into the allosexual gaze, just like there is a male gaze. This view of life that says that everyone must be interested in someone, and the way that Felicity is validated because clearly someone is interested in dating her, so if she did want to, then, you know, she had an option. That's not the point. She isn't interested in engaging in those things, so why does she need to be validated by the idea that someone would date her if she wanted to? Because that's so not the point. Less of that, please, from all authors hoping to tackle asexuality and aromanticism. No non-consensual kisses for proving sexuality, ever. Thank you. But yeah, in general, much preferred this to The Gentleman's Guide, and on balance would recommend. I don't think I'll be keeping The Gentleman's Guide on my shelves, however I will be keeping The Lady's Guide. In terms of representation, we have a subtle amount of lesbian/women interested in women, but primarily we have aromantic and asexual representation giving us the nice A at the end of the acronym. Very pleased to have read this one. It was good on balance. Now I have None of the Above by I.W. Gregorio. This is another one that I mentioned in my recent haul video that I was very excited to get to. This is the story of Kristen, who is a teenage girl going to high school, who has just made homecoming queen. She's got a scholarship to the university of her dreams. She is a running star. She has a loving relationship. All is going well for her. Until the night that she attempts to have sex for the first time with her boyfriend, and she experiences excruciating pain. They have to stop, and she goes to the doctors to check if everything's okay. Everything is okay, however, she gets diagnosed with AIS, androgen insensitivity syndrome. She is in every way female, except that she has a male system within her. So she naturally goes through a whole course of different emotions in having to process that she is not who she thought she was. And then the news gets leaked to everyone in her school as she is trying to process this. And everything goes tits up. I thought this book was so interesting. It explored gender in a really interesting way from the perspective of someone who definitely identifies as a woman and had no reason to question her gender ever until she realised that she was not biologically female. It had great sensitivity when talking about intersex issues, especially it talked about being intersex within the sports world, because Kristen is a running star. She is the fastest girl in her school, and yet when the news gets broken that she is intersex, immediately all of that comes into question. Is it because she has a lot of testosterone in her body that she is so fast? The case of Caster Semenya gets brought up, things like that. It is very in-depth and broad, especially for a fairly short book. It's a little bit shallow in places, and I was not a big fan of the ending because Kristen gets validated by male attention in order to accept herself. but broadly I thought it dealt with the subject in a really, really interesting, nuanced way, and I really enjoyed Kristen as a character. I felt that although it was a little cliched at points, it was heartwarmingly so. It was nicely cheesy, and I could completely accept that as part of the story, alongside the more in-depth discussions about what it means to be a woman and things like that. And similarly to In Wonderland, talking about validating your gender via male attention and particularly male sexual desire was absolutely fascinating. So yeah, bit of a short review for this one because there wasn't a huge amount to say, but I thought this was really well done. And considering intersex identities are still a very, very new thing to mainstream society, I thought it was excellent to have a YA book that explored this. This is the first time I've read anything about being intersex, aside from things like The Case of Caster Semenya, and that was only because it hit the mainstream after she was banned from sports. So yeah, definitely recommend this book. In terms of representation, we get our I for intersex. First book I've ever seen that talks about this. One of the first things I've ever seen that talks about this. Next this month, I reread If We Were Villains by ML Rio. Woo! We know I love this book. I did a video on it shortly after I read it for the first time, which I will put somewhere so that you can watch that. I won't talk about it a huge amount. This is the story of Oliver Marks, a theatre student who has just come out of jail after serving 10 years for the murder of one of his classmates. However, the detective that put him in jail doesn't believe that he was actually the one who killed his classmate, and so Oliver relives his final year at Delaware University and talks about the events that led up to the death of one of his classmates. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. Again, during my reread, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and my thoughts have only changed on a very couple of things. In my first video, I talked about how the three female characters are quite stereotyped. I didn't feel the same way this time. I actually felt a lot more warm towards all three of them. Ren still definitely comes across as a bit sidelined, bit manic pixie dream girl, a little bit, you know, she's only relevant to how the boys feel about her. However, I thought Philippa and Meredith stood out a lot more, and I was genuinely quite impressed with the writing of them this time. The other thing was that because this was a reread, I knew the characters already, and I felt it gave a very similar feeling to that which you're meant to feel about Oliver's classmates. He's known his classmates for 4 years at the point at which the year of the murder happens, and so the whole point is that he feels like he knows these people really well, and so the changes that occur within their group dynamic are startling for him. And because I had read this book before and was then rereading it, I knew these characters just like Oliver did, and so it became much more interesting because I had these views of who they were and who they became within the story, which was brilliant. It makes things like their trust in each other so much more understandable, it makes their reactions to the things that the others do so much more understandable, and I just really enjoyed it. I put this book in the video because it does have LGBT representation in it. However, I wasn't quite going to include it just because it feels quite heterosexual. The characters feel like they've been made gay or bisexual mostly for plot purpose rather than as part of their character development and personality within the story. However, it is still representation, so I thought I'd put it in. The main character, Oliver, bisexual as hell. In my first video, I talked a bit about thinking that perhaps his relationship with a girl was a bit compulsory heterosexuality, but now I'm like, no, this boy is just incredibly bisexual. So yeah, bit of bi rep, bit of gay rep in this as well, but much more minor. Loved this book. Had to include it anyway, just because, I love it. Please read this book. And then we get into the final 2 books of this. I realised as I was coming to make this video that although I had actually hit on quite a lot of representation that is quite few and far between in literature, intersex identities, asexuality, trans identities, I actually hadn't got the main 2 of the acronym. I didn't have a book about lesbians and I didn't have a book about gay people. There were books with relationships between 2 women and books with relationships between 2 men, but those characters didn't have explicitly gay and lesbian identities. So I went for 2 rereads that I mentioned in my last video so that I could pad it out, get this video done, and also do some of my necessary rereads. So, second to last book, I reread Pulp by Robin Talley. I love Robin Talley as an author. If you are looking for books about being a lesbian in general, she writes a huge number of them on a whole range of different topics, especially historical stories. So if you're interested in that, give her a go. Pulp is a story that follows dual narratives, one being a girl named Janet who is living in the 1950s who discovers lesbian pulp fiction and starts to realise that she has feelings for her female best friend, and about her then trying to keep this relationship with another girl secret during McCarthyism in America and the huge prosecution of people who were gay during that time. And then with the other narrative we follow Abby, who is a high schooler in America in 2017 who is doing a research project as she tries to get over breaking up with her girlfriend. And she decides to study lesbian pulp fiction, in particular an author named Marion Love, whose work may just coincide with Janet's storyline as well. I thought this book wasn't as good this time reading it. I just wasn't as engaged with the story. I think it's quite a slow pace and it's quite hard to be interested in Abby studying for school projects and being sad about her ex versus Janet fearing like for her life and her family's welfare during the 50s. However, I did think it talked about a lot of very valuable things, and I thought it was also generally just a great research starting point. If you are someone who is interested in LGBT history, in particular about American history of lesbians and lesbian culture, this gives you so many good starting points. It uses real names of real places and real books and real people so that you can do your own research and learn about this very important part of queer culture. Can't fault that. I thought it was really interesting, mostly in exploring how just knowing that one other person has experienced the same thing as you can help a huge amount, because Janet has never questioned her thoughts about things until she suddenly realises that you can be a lesbian, and then suddenly her perspective on life opens. And there is a whole realm of possibility because she reads this book by a lesbian author, and then Abby, when she is reading the works of Marion Love in 2017, feels so incredibly seen. She already knows that she's a lesbian, but it gives her a whole new outlook and it makes her feel incredibly related to. I thought it was just fantastic in that way, showing the value of representation in that way and just generally in knowing that you aren't alone in what you feel. It reminded me very much of those web weaving Tumblr posts. I don't know if you've seen them, but they're posts where people will find snippets of songs and poems and books or pieces of art and things like that, and they will all have this similar thread running through them, and yet these will be pieces of art that are centuries, millennia apart in different genres and styles and mediums and all the rest, and yet they are connected by one human emotion or sentiment. And they make me emotional because it's like, oh my god, humans connecting through art. Unbelievably. So cool. Gave me big vibes of that. I also liked that at the very ending it had quite an asexual, aromantic message in a way. Both Abby and Janet, as they reach the end of their narratives within the story, realise that you don't need true love to be happy, and that actually one relationship, no matter how much you value it or think it is your happy ending, isn't the be-all and end-all, and that you have so much more life to live after that. I thought it explored some really cool stuff. As a book, I was less engaged with it than other things that I've read. However, I can't fault it, and I would still very much recommend it to other people, so lesbian rep ticked off. And then finally, for my book about gay men, I have Jack of Hearts and Other Parts. I didn't really enjoy this very much, unfortunately. I reread it for the first time since the first time I'd read it, and I just wasn't a fan of it. This is the story of a gay teenager named Jack, who is incredibly sexually active. He is an out gay boy in America, and he is distinctly non-monogamous, not in that he's dating a lot, just that he's doing a lot of sleeping around. So when his friend asks him to do a sex advice column for her blog, he says, sure. And then he starts getting some really creepy messages shoved into his locker, sent to the email for these sex advice inquiries, taped to his front door with things like "I can hear you" scrawled on the back. It's incredibly creepy, I have to say. I mentioned this in my last video when I was talking about this book, but I'm not scared easily by like murder mysteries and thrillers in general, and I will seek them out. However, the stalker plotline in this, absolutely terrifying. However, I have a big problem with this story, and that is that the plot does not make sense. The whole thing is that Jack is being sent these threatening messages, and that it is getting incredibly obsessive and stalkerish very, very quickly, and yet he refuses to tell the adults in his life about it. His mum is incredibly supportive. She knows he's gay, she knows he sleeps around, she knows he runs a sex column. As a reader, I am given no reason to believe that if Jack told his mum, it wouldn't end. And yet he doesn't tell her, and instead there are 300 pages of him trying to make these elaborate plans to catch whoever is leaving these notes, including to the point where he gives in to the blackmail and sends nudes of himself as an underage person to this person who he has no idea of the identity of, in the hope it will make it stop. And it just doesn't make sense, because I have no reason to believe his mum wouldn't immediately support him. We are given reason to believe that his school wouldn't do something about it, but that is nowhere near the same thing, and actually that gave some really, really good discussions about schools' involvement with harassment and especially the protection of queer students. That bothered me, didn't appreciate that, and as a result I just felt like the book was a bit of a waste of time, if I'm honest. I didn't dislike it, it just made me go, oh, this really doesn't make sense, you know? So I think I may well say goodbye to this one. My other complaint is it's just too steamy for me. I enjoyed the steaminess when I read it the first time, but now I read it and I'm just like, just not interested in it. Still got that gay rep in. I still don't think it's I don't think it's a bad book. Do I think it is the best? Do I think it's well done? Not particularly. There we have it. Those are the seven queer books that I read during Pride Month, giving a wide spectrum of perspectives on queer identity, of relationships, of gender, of society, all these different things. A really, really interesting mix, and it was excellent at getting me out of that damn reading slump. I've been really looking forward to reading during this month because I had set up such an interesting array of books, so highly recommend it. Try and tick off all those letters in the acronym and see where it gets you in terms of the stories you're reading. But yeah, thank you very much for watching. I hope this was fun to watch. I hope this gave you some good recommendations for various queer stories, especially if you're looking for books about more marginalised identities, those that aren't even recognised within the queer community itself in particular. Yeah, thank you for watching. Feel free to like this video if you liked it. Comment down below any of the queer books that you've read during Pride Month. Were you making an effort to diversify your reading in this month? Because I did my best. Feel free to subscribe if you want to see more of my bookish content, and I will see you next time. With what? Who is just... It was a really... nice voice break. Oh, I'm getting warm. Ugh, I hate filming in the summer. Ugh.